Well, good morning, everyone. So I have two stories to tell you now. One of them is one I didn't want to tell you before because I was embarrassed. And the other one is the great way it was solved. So a few weeks, maybe a month or 6 weeks ago, I don't know. And Jen's like, yeah, it was way back. I was actually going to do something around the house for the first time in a while. And and I went looking for that drill my dad had given me for my birthday, probably years ago. And of course, I didn't know where the drill was, or the kit that went with it with all the drill bits, or any of it. And I was really bothered by it, and I came up here to the church because I knew I used it when we put the Christmas signs out. And it had to be somewhere around here. And I looked and looked and looked, and I couldn't find it, and I finally gave up. So I have lost a drill. And I was like, man, I'm telling you, I've really gotten senile as I've turned 35, which is scary. Because I'm not that old yet, I don't think. But sure enough, this week, we've got that house that sits over here on it's not our lot, it's their lot. But we're all kind of tied together over here, that house. Well, the neighbors had found it in the grass somewhere where I'd left it, threw it in his truck, and forgot to come over and bring it to us until this week. So I got my drill back. Still haven't done anything with it, but I have the drill. So I was so busy celebrating that, I actually locked myself out of my truck yesterday. So basically, that one thing turned out better, but I'm still going to have to work on this. This turning 35 is hurting me. We started a new series a couple weeks ago on the 10 Commandments. And even though, the 10 Commandments, it feels like it should be Christianity 101, the truth is we don't often get into them as deeply as we could. We often stay on the surface, and I felt like it was necessary to see them as these teachings God handed down to us as a bit of a summary of His law and a bit of a way of breaking down what He desires for us, His wisdom, His knowledge. And so we have now done 4 of them, the first 4. There's the number 1 command was no other gods. Number 2 was no idols. Number 3 was to honor the name of God. And number 4, to honor the day of God. And so those first 4 kind of make up the category of commands that deal with our relationship to Him. For the most part, and we broke each of them down in different ways, but for the most part, it's to understand that He is to be our number 1. Even at the level of, the Old Testament makes a comparison between God and cheating on Him with another God is like a spouse. Cheating on your spouse, that they are supposed to be your one and only, and that jealousy is appropriate considering the God who spoke this. We talked about doing our best not to take complex laws and break them down to the simplest ways of doing them, but to realize them in all of their fullness. So when it says don't take the name of the Lord in vain, that doesn't necessarily mean only that we shouldn't say things like, oh my goodness, but not say goodness. But it actually has to do with honoring God in our heart, His name, understanding its importance and its relevance, and leaving the weight in the name when we talk about Him. And when we talk about the Sabbath day, we distinguished it between the Lord's Day in the New Testament and the Sabbath day of the Old Testament, and talked about how God had wisdom in telling us to rest. But now as we finish that section up, we now move into the next section. Scholars have long recognized that the first 4 commands deal with our relationship with God, and the next 6 have to do with our relationship to one another. And once again, as we venture into this territory, we need to remember a couple things. 1, not to break these down into simple and easy to follow things, but rather to capture their fullness as to what they are. And 2, that all of them will really come back to the idea of respecting one another as people who were made in the image of God. And so in order to get into this idea, let's talk a little bit about the New Testament, and then we're going to go back to these commands. Because I think Jesus And these next three, honor your father and mother, no murder, no adultery, each of them were addressed by Jesus at different times. And in each of them, he did the same thing. So you get into the New Testament. And if you recall, there's this one part in Matthew where Jesus, he gets up on a mountainside and he starts preaching to this crowd. And we've gone over this several times. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. And scholars have long noticed that there are parallels between the Sermon on the Mount and the commands of Moses on Mount Sinai. Jesus is taking the figure or the role of sort of a new Moses and giving his commands to the people. And in it, he addresses some of these. And by the way, they're from a mountain in both cases, Mount Sinai and the mountain where Jesus is when he gives his Sermon on the Mount. And in each of them, Jesus is pointing out something, namely that he's not actually changing the laws, but instead pointing out their full and original meaning. So for instance, if you want to follow along, you can open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 5. And notice how Jesus addresses the laws of the Old Testament. And I think this will give us a little bit of insight. So in Matthew chapter 5, if you were to say, pick up in verse 17. And he tells the people who are watching, it says, do not think that I have come. This is as the symbolic Moses, new Moses here, giving his laws. He says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets, that is the Old Testament. I have not come to abolish them, but to, and what's that word? Fulfill them. Now, in prophecies, you understand fulfillment, like, okay, he said it was going to happen, it happened. But what about in law? What does that mean, to fulfill them? Well, I think it means to bring them to their full meaning, their original intent. Not to break them down into a superficial set of do and do not, but to understand what they were really about. We can keep going here. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. He's saying, look, the law is not going away. These are still the commands and ideas and wisdom of God. I'm not telling you to break them. But here's what I am telling you, and I'm going to actually skip and go to verse 20 just for the sake of brevity. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. And kingdom of heaven is what Jesus has been talking about. It says, you are my people in this new kingdom I'm bringing to earth. And these are the laws that I'm giving. And I want you to know about the nature of these laws, that unless you do your righteousness and your morality better than the Pharisees, you can't even get in the front door. And I imagine there was a little bit of a moment of shock right there. Because if you know anything at all about the Pharisees, they were like the strictest people there were. They were the guys who took the law and broke it down and knew every bit of it and followed all of these rules all the time, everywhere they went. And Jesus says, if you can't do better than that, you don't even get in the front door. Why would he say that? Why would he scare them off? But I think as you get into it, as you try to understand it, you'll find what Jesus means by that. He means that when he's bringing fullness to the law, he wants to get back to their original intent. And now, with that in mind, we're going to go back to Exodus, and let's look at the next commandment, and let's see how Jesus treats that one. I know, I'm kind of jumping you around, but follow me as best you can, please. Exodus chapter 20. We get the fifth commandment. Says it like this: honor your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. Seems simple, right? Honor your father and mother. They're rather important people. Maybe do right by them as best that you can. Now watch how Jesus deals with it in the New Testament. If you can, kind of keep your finger there in Exodus, but jump over to Mark chapter 7. And you'll see this command come up. And you'll see how Jesus sort of expands on its original meaning and how we have a way of sort of bypassing its greater meaning for a lot of details that sort of muck it up. So, here we are in chapter 7. I'll just begin in verse 1. to set the stage of the conversation. But Jesus is having a conversation with some Pharisees about an issue of the law. And he's going to then clarify how he feels about things. And when I say that, Jesus is he'll let you know how he feels about things. We don't often give him credit for that, but he does. The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were defiled. That is, unwashed. Now, that doesn't mean washing your hands like we wash our hands before food. This is a ceremonial hand cleaning. This is a Jewish tradition, right? Verse 3, the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. That's a reference to probably something called either the Talmud or the Mishnah. These were collections of rabbis' writings where they would expand upon things in the Old Testament and tell you exactly what they meant, down to the rules they wanted to give. And so they would take commands and then they would expand on them with the rabbi's tradition, and these rabbi commentaries were almost at the authoritative level of the Scripture itself. And you'll see how this gets mixed up, right? So the tradition of the elders is likely Mishnah or Talmud, but it's rabbi commentary on the Scriptures. When they came from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. Mark is filling us in for us who don't have a deep background of Jewish ceremonial laws, which is most of us. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with defiled hands? Why don't you do what all of us do? Why don't you do what the Talmud and the descriptions of the laws by the rabbis say? Why don't you follow these traditions? I mean, you're sitting there eating with unwashed hands. We're a little bit offended by this. Tell me, Jesus, why aren't you doing what is traditional and good and right?" And then he comes back and quotes Scripture to them. He replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules." One thing about rabbis is what? They're human. And to misunderstand the commentaries of the rabbis rather than the Scriptures of God itself would be a mistake. And what that ultimately creates is this sense of hypocrisy, this sense that we honor you in one way with our mouth and on the outside and with the things that we do outside of us, but inside, we're still lacking something. There's something not genuine inside. And Jesus is calling them out on this. And then he responds to their request, their question about why he doesn't follow the traditions. And he says, "You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions. These don't rise to the level of Scripture itself." And he continued, "You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions." Now, I know we started on honor your father and mother. How did we get here, right? We're getting there, I promise. Verse 10. For Moses said, here's his example, "Honor your father and mother, and anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death." That's one chapter later. "But you say that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is korban," it's a fancy technical word, we'll explain in a minute, "that is devoted to God, then you no longer let them do anything for their father or mother. Thus, you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and you do many things like that." This is one example of 100 I could have given. Now, he says that in some way, they have the commands of God. In this case, the example is honor your father and mother, but then they have their traditions. And to some extent, they will follow their traditions before they follow the commands of God. And he says this is one example of a lot of times that you do this. Now, let's try to understand what was going on. And honestly, the information about Korban is a little bit, it's kind of hard to know exactly what was going on, but we kind of get the gist. The gist is that you know that you have this righteous responsibility to take care of the people who took care of you as a child, to provide for them, to take care of them, to spend time with them, and to show them love. But instead, for whatever reason, you say, no, this guy gave a really great sermon, and now I have declared all of my wealth Korban, given to the treasury of the temple, devoted to God's use and Him alone. But now, I'm sorry, Mom and Dad, you're just going to have to live destitute because I gave my money to the church. And is it really that, did they do it in a rash vow? I don't know. Did they do it because they wanted to spite their parents and not have to provide for them? I don't know. Could they get away with giving a small amount to the church in order to never have to give anything to their parents? I don't know. Was it something that they didn't have to actually follow through on when they made the rash vow, and so they could say it, not have to give anything to their parents, and then never have to follow through on giving to the temple? Was it something that they didn't actually have to do until they died? Like, I devote all of my wealth, and when I die, it's going to the church, so I'm sorry I can't give it to you now. I don't know. I had a lot of questions I couldn't get answered this week. But the idea is that for whatever reason, their religious duty is getting in the way of their religious duty. Their desire to appear righteous and to follow these traditions and to say, hey, I'm giving my money to something else, is getting in the way of doing what's right. And sometimes you've got to be human before you can be this exceptional person who gives all your money to some great cause, or at least appears to. You've got to, in your heart, do the right thing. And here you have this command. Honor your father and your mother, which at least here seems to imply a certain amount of call them. Take care of them best as you can. And boy, that's hard in our world today because we travel, we move, we go to different places. It's not easy, but in some way, love your mom and dad, respect and honor them. And probably your religious duty and your human traditions shouldn't really get in the way of that holy command of God. Because in our world, you might be rewarded for doing one and not the other. But in the eyes of God, you miss something. You've let one tradition get in the way of the holy command of God. And this is just one of a category of things that Jesus struggles with regards to the Pharisees. Their ability to appear righteous in one way and to neglect the duty of God in another. And that's problematic. Just to follow up on this idea of taking care of our loved ones, our parents, our guardians, whoever it is that meant something to us when we were young. I know that not everyone had great parents, and you have to it's hard to just command flatly a certain way of treating them. And I recognize that the world is different now, and we live farther away from one another. And I recognize that not everyone can, because of medical issues, take care of someone in their own home. And I recognize that sometimes it's better that they go to another place where they can be taken care of. And I recognize that there are all these buts and maybe and why and so on and so forth, and all of that's in there, and I take it into account. But the implications might suggest here that there are too many lonely folk who never get a phone call. I did all of my intern hours in school, actually in the nursing home. And what's funny about that, and I imagine nurses and CNAs have the same experience, you feel like you know them better than their family because you spend time with them every single day, and the family calls once a month. And sometimes it's in their heads that the family doesn't love them or take care of them. Sometimes that's not really true or genuine. Sometimes they forget. But sometimes there are people who probably could have done a little better. I think it's okay to recognize that. And all of us probably ought to remember that command and do our best to honor those people who respected us and took care of us when we were younger. Just too many lonely folks in the world, too separated. Perhaps another relevant passage in 1 Timothy. Paul is writing to Timothy, who's trying to pastor a church, and he's a young guy, and they're dealing with different issues in the church. One of them is that the church would like to take care of widows, and they do. They apparently send out food and things like that, take care of the widows, but Timothy needs some more specific instruction, and this one little detail shows up in there that I think is somewhat relevant to this conversation. This is 1 Timothy chapter 7. Is that right? No. There's no 1 Timothy 7. Okay. 1 Timothy 5. Verse 3. Give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, these should learn, first of all, to put their religion into practice by caring for their own family and so repaying their parents and grandparents, for this is pleasing to God. That is, the church will gladly take care of widows, but if someone is able to take care of the people in their family, then they should. And that's the fifth commandment. Honor your father and mother. And you see how things you could gloss over are so much deeper when we get into it. So much more full. And speaking of that fullness, go back to your, well, actually, let's go back to Exodus first. Exodus 20. Let's do the next two commands here. Exodus chapter 20, verse 13 and 14. Now we're getting into the thou shalt nots, right? They become very quick after this. No murder, adultery, stealing, lying, or coveting. Can you guys repeat that? No murder, adultery, stealing, lying, or coveting. One more time. Do it with me if you can. Murder, adultery, stealing, lying, coveting. You guys just memorized half of the 10 Commandments. I'm impressed. We have murder followed immediately by adultery. And Jesus also addresses both of these. And not in Mark 7 was sort of one thing. This is going back to the Sermon on the Mount, his fulfillment of the Old Testament laws. And he addresses each one. So go back to Matthew chapter 5 and verse 21. Now, if the other thing scared you about honoring your father and mother, wait till you read this one. Matthew 5, verse 21. You have heard that it was said to people long ago, that is, you've heard this commandment, right? This was in the Old Testament. You remember that? You've heard that it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. Yeah, I've heard that one. So far, I'm good. You shall not murder. Anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, I don't know what that means, but it's some kind of an insult. You guys try and use that in the car next time. I'm just curious. Someone cuts you off, go, Raka. Is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Now, I'm not trying to scare people. The grace of God is incredible, and we've all made mistakes in this area. What's incredible, though, is that Jesus is taking a law that seems pretty simple, like don't murder someone, and bringing it back to its original intent and trying to stop sin before it ever becomes a part of your life. Because at the source of murder is anger. And anger is harder to deal with, harder to stop. It requires you not only to avoid doing something of great violence, but avoid letting that feeling of violence and desire to hurt someone consume you. Nip it in the bud. Stop it before it ever gets anywhere. Watch your words, your mouth, your language, the things you say, the things you do. Bring this law that says don't murder and take it back to its heart. And so Jesus says, do better than the letter. We learn to be at peace, to be patient, to be kind. We get things like the fruits of the Spirit, which are things of being rather than things of doing. That you would, the fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. These are the people we are to become. The fruit of the Spirit is to overflow within us. It's not that we didn't bother to murder someone. It's that we control our own anger within us, that we might become the people of God. And all of a sudden I understand what he means when he says, bringing the law to its fulfillment. And at the core of all this is a fancy theological term we often call the imago Dei. It's the image of God. Because you remember in Genesis, right? And God creates the world, and then he says, let us make man in what? Our image. And we can debate all day exactly what that means and all the implications of it, but that's not actually this sermon. But what I do want to say in this sermon is that implies something about every single person born on this planet, which is that they too were made in the image of God. Men, women, Democrats, conservatives, people we like, people we don't like, old folks, young folk, people of different race, people who did wrong things when they were younger, people who are still doing wrong things. Every one of them was made in the image of God. And if that's true, there's a certain amount of respect due them. Because someone made in the image of God should be treated as a child of God himself, someone that Jesus died for on the cross. And as such, things like murder are not only condemned, but anger itself needs to be examined and controlled. Because that person too is made in the image of God. And truth be told, I could take that opening and begin every single one of these next several commandments. To respect the imago Dei is the heart of the law. The value and respect of life itself, made in the image of God. So not only when I respect someone made in the image of God, do I not murder them, but I also don't take advantage of them by committing adultery. I don't take advantage of their image or consume them in some way inappropriate to the Spirit of God. I don't steal from them because they too were made in the image of God. I don't lie to them because I respect them more than that. I don't covet the things they have because I know that I'm no more deserving of anything than they are. Every single one of these commands goes back to respecting the person made in the image of God. Just as the earlier ones went to respecting the God who made us in our image. So murder, that might seem like the easiest one. But at its heart, controlling our anger and respecting the other person is everything. This is something that I have said, and I hope you won't hate me for it. There are a lot of people who say things like, well, you got to earn my respect. Or you can do something and I can't respect you anymore after that or this or whatever. I got to be honest. It doesn't sound very biblical to me. As far as I'm concerned, you don't have to earn my respect. I give it away freely with no questions asked, and you won't lose it either. Treat me how you want to treat me, and I will always respect you back, or at least I'll try. I'm not perfect. But that's my ideal in life. And I think respect captures a bit of what God wants from us. That's commandment number 6. We're flying. Let's get into commandment number 7. We already read it. I won't make you read it again in Exodus, but after murder, you guys memorized it, right? What's after murder? Adultery. You guys, I tell you what, it's just amazing. Adultery. Well, at the heels of Jesus finishing his commentary on murder, he gets right into the next commandment. I mean, literally, they're in order in Exodus. They're in order in the 10 Commandments. Exodus and the Sermon on the Mount. Sorry. I know what I'm saying. We get now to Matthew chapter 5 and verse 27. And now he enters into this one. And if the other two scared you, wait till you read this one, right? You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, isn't that where it goes? Verse 29, there it is. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Let me just pause. This probably is not a literal instruction. It's not. This is a statement to make you understand the severity of sin. A statement to make you understand that we should do what we can to rid ourselves of sin. And so this is not something we're recommending you follow through in exactly that sense. But that you understand that the command not to commit adultery, that starts somewhere. It doesn't start the day you commit adultery. It started 6 months before, a year before, maybe a couple of years before. It started with a wink or a flirt or a lingering gaze. And just like how anger is the origin of our murder, lust and longing for something you can't have is at the core of our problems with adultery. And you could easily dismiss, well, I haven't done that yet. Or you could look at yourself more seriously, more introspectively, and say, but I haven't always controlled that instinct the way I wanted to. That's what the law about adultery is about. A quick story, and I'll try to be as discreet as I can, but I remember a conversation I had in high school with a guy, and to be fair, I don't believe he was really a believer or a Christian in any sense, but we ended up on a conversation about watching movies or pornography or things we shouldn't watch. And he knew that I was trying not to do such things. And he looked at me one time and he said, yeah, but at least I'm not going out there and getting a girl pregnant. And I'm sorry, I know this is a serious subject. The reason I bring that up is because we have this sense of, well, one thing's better than another. And I wonder why we never strive to do the extraordinary thing. Why we've got to walk up to that line and try not to cross it, rather than just avoiding it altogether. One of the things, baseball analogy, if you know anything about baseball, and I'm not saying that I know a lot, but if you pitch to the catcher in baseball, right, they say, don't just aim at the glove, otherwise you're going to be thrown like this, and you're probably going to fall short. They say you throw through the catcher to the backstop. Am I right? Okay, there. So someone who plays baseball told me. And what I feel like is with our moral goals, we have this tendency to aim and just try not to mess up too bad. Instead of rearing back and throwing it through the catcher to the backstop. Instead of searching for the extraordinary. Instead of trying to avoid adultery, we actually look to destroy the sense of lust within us, that we might become the people of God. Why not do better? That's the goal. And we live in a world in which, in particular, this hunger, this appetite can be met at every moment. And it is so, so hard to do it right. Even things like pornography that have set the hearts of so many people in our world on fire. We would be amazed if we actually talked about it openly. It is so hard to control. And I want you to know that if you think that's innocent, one of the things scholars wonder is when when he goes from saying, not to commit adultery and not to lust, he then goes after the eye and the hand. And have you ever thought why he chose those body parts? You ever thought any more deeply about that? Because those are the ones that offend us the most. And in lust, and in pornography, and in that battle, we've got to learn to nip it in the bud. We've got to be bold enough to talk about that and to overcome. And by the way, what we just said about respecting the other person and their imago Dei, being made in the image of God, goes to this too. Because someone made in the image of God, you don't consume like a dessert. Someone made in the image of God, you respect, and you treat them as the full person that they are. And that not only means you don't murder them, it means you don't consume them. And it all ties together. Because at the heart of these 10 Commandments is the wisdom of God. And it's not something we aim not to mess up too bad. It's something we throw right through in our efforts to become the people he called us to be. We should respect our parents as the people who gave us life. We should respect life itself and how we talk about murder and other lies and anger even. We should respect people's dignity and not just avoid adultery, but avoid consuming them and lusting after them and letting our eyes linger. We should nip sin in the bud. We should become people who respect the imago Dei in everyone. And all of a sudden, these commands of the Old Testament in Exodus 20 no longer feel like something for the dark ages, but actually like something that could help us now. And the commands of Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount were not so much about giving us new laws, but about fulfilling the original meaning of the old ones, and in fact challenging us greatly today. So we haven't figured it out yet. The truth is, the meaning of the law is deep, full of nuance and thought, and when we give our time to it, we have an understanding of why we have to do better than the Pharisees to get in the front door. Because breaking them down into the easiest to follow tasks does not demonstrate being the people of God. But putting the laws of God in our heart and letting God make us into someone new is. A couple of application points. I always try and finish with a few application points. Number one, I'd ask you, if you got some time to study this week, I want you to go back and forth between the 10 Commandments and at least the first chapter in that Sermon on the Mount. And I put the references up there, chapter 20, 1 through 17 in Exodus. With Matthew 5, just to narrow down a little bit, I'm going to say verse 17 through 42. And I want you to look at Moses and the new Moses, and I want you to compare and understand how are they different and how are they the same. And what did Jesus do to bring about their fullness? This is the academic approach, right? But this is a good exercise to do. Go and look at them, compare them, and see if God doesn't grant you some insights or something that captures your attention. Number two, pay attention to how you speak about people. Does the way you speak about people, whether they're around or not around, demonstrate your respect for their imago Dei? One of the hardest things to control is our mouths. And so paying attention to how we speak is one of the easiest ways to address this issue. Number three, if in fact there's a sexual struggle in your life, please find the confidence or the courage to reveal it to someone you trust in order that they can hold you accountable to doing better. I will say I've had my own struggles in this area. I was single for a long time. And we all need help. And so I just encourage you, as long as it stays in the darkness, you will not be able to overcome it. That's just the truth. And number 4, going back to the honor your father and mother, call your parents. Call up mom or dad. Say hi if you can. Or call up someone who took care of you. Just spend time with some loved ones. Do your best to respect those who invested in you. I think that's kind of part of what Jesus or Moses was getting at. Now, with all these things, I really don't want to end the sermon on some kind of a ouch moment, like, oh man, this is painful. Because truth be told, that we're supposed to leave Sunday with a moment of celebration. I mean, Sunday is the Lord's day, as we talked about last week. We do it on Sunday because that's the first day of the week, which is the day Jesus raised from the grave. And so we gather together and we say, God loved me enough to send his son to die for me on the cross. And because of that unequivocal statement, I know that grace exists. And I know that all the places I fall short, God can forgive me of and more. That we accept grace on his behalf in order that we might demonstrate grace to others. That the next sinner in line might come to him and get grace too. And so no matter what you've struggled with or where you've been or how dark it has felt or which of the commands you have broken, the grace of God is available and for you. And that's why we're here. Yes, we pause to recognize our own sinfulness because that's the only way I know to become better people and to really appreciate the grace of God that's given us. But that is what leads us to our celebration and our joy and our singing every week.